Relocation, Indian Life on Skid Row by Ed Goodvoice. Introduction. During and after World War II, many American Indian people relocated from their reservations to urban areas with the expectation of a better lifestyle than the one they had left behind. The government's relocation program, which started in 1952, provided paid transportation to a city, help finding a job and a place to live, and a small stipend until the first paycheck came in. All of these conditions sounded ideal to many Indians who were eager to begin working and living in the big city. Hopes were raised that perhaps it was now possible to fulfill some of those dreams of a good job, clothes, and a nice place to live, and maybe even a nice shiny car that could someday be driven back to the reservation. Within the first 6 months, these dreams for life in the city were put on hold. Rent was high and housing was often poor, especially for relocated families with children. The big city, with its fast pace and impersonal attitude, among other problems, plagued relocatees. Many became frustrated and discouraged, beginning a downward spiral onto Skid Row. I came to Chicago on relocation, arriving on October 5th, 1957, from the Rosebud Sioux Reservation in South Dakota. I was single and 27 years old. I got off the train at the Northwestern Depot on Madison and Canal Streets, carrying written directions to the YMCA where all the relocatees were sent. It was cold and windy as I stepped out onto that infamous Skid Row of West Madison Street. Fine powdery snow was falling and blowing about in this place they called the Windy City. Although I had been advised not to by relatives who had been here on relocation and had returned to the reservation, I immediately headed west when I got out on the street. I did not find an Indian bar or see any Indians. I walked for several blocks on this stormy night, and I stopped in at a bar to have a shot of wine. I was hoping to see an Indian face. No such luck. This was my introduction to West Madison Street. I finally headed east on Madison Street in what I hoped would be the general direction of the YMCA at 826 South Wabash. I had cab fare, but was content to walk and explore, though few people were on the street. I walked for about 2 hours. After what seemed like an all-night walk, I finally found the YMCA and checked in. This YMCA was where all the Native Americans coming into Chicago on relocation were housed for the first week or so. Although rooms were rented at a discounted price for Native Americans on the program, I was told that those rooms were all taken, and I would have to pay the full price. I was tired, so I was willing to pay the price. The YMCA was to become my home for the next 4 weeks. Its policies were strict. You had to show your key at the elevator and go directly to the floor on which your room was assigned. I had arranged for a 7 a.m. wake-up call because I had instructions to report to the relocation office, located 3 blocks from the YMCA at Harrison and Dearborn at 9 a.m. on October 6th. I got up before the wake-up call came because I was anxious and in a hurry to begin my new life in Chicago. I wanted a new lifestyle that would include a good-paying job, a nice apartment, and a late-model car. When I went out, it was still cold, but the snowstorm had passed, and I walked out of the YMCA with my dream. The Conrad Hilton Hotel was located about half a block across the street from YMCA. Beyond this great hotel, I could see Grant Park and, of course, Lake Michigan. The sight of the lake reminded me of my first glimpse of the Pacific Ocean in the early 50s when I was on my way to boot camp in San Diego, California. Since I had plenty of time before my appointment at the relocation office, I continued to walk north on Wabash and was surprised to actually see a whole train traveling between buildings on what appeared to be a long railroad bridge. I had no idea that a train also ran underground. I later learned that this was called the elevated train and that part of the route was called the loop. After retracing my steps back to the YMCA, I did not want to get lost on the first day. I timidly requested directions to the relocation office from a white man. I use the term timid because Indians rarely initiated conversations with a white man. Back on the reservation, when working for a white farmer or rancher, you were a hired hand and you did not talk much. Since I had $3 or $4 left over, I decided to get some breakfast. I found a combination bar and snack shop just off 9th and State Streets. It was only a block or so from the YMCA. A middle-aged, gray-haired, fat but friendly Italian man appeared to be the proprietor and cook. The long counter showed signs of wear, but it was clean. I was greeted with a hearty, "Good morning, Chief." I felt the veins go taut in my neck. I looked around at a couple of guys sitting at one of the only two booths that were crowded into the corner of the snack shop. These two guys were Native Americans. I immediately felt a sense of relief as I headed in their direction. I was no longer a stranger in Chicago. Native Americans do not ordinarily take a direct approach when meeting another Native. However, I was acquainted with one of those guys. He was a Navajo whom I had met on a skid row in Los Angeles in the mid-1950s. These two men were already veterans of the relocation program. They had been in Chicago a while and had jobs working the temporary Christmas rush at the main post office, loading and unloading bags of mail. The Navajo, a few years later, was found stabbed to death on an uptown area beach. The other Native, a Sioux, returned to his reservation in South Dakota. This was a pattern that many Native Americans would follow in the 2 decades after the 1953 Relocation Act. But I'm getting ahead of myself. After a hearty breakfast, 60 cents back in those days, and an almost endless conversation about relocation and jobs they sent you to, I anxiously said that I had a 9 a.m. appointment at the relocation office. Words of encouragement followed me out of the door as I began the 2.5-block walk to the office. As I was about to enter the building, I could almost sense the cold and gloomy atmosphere that seems to come with these federally sponsored programs. I still had visions of being shuffled from one office building to another, as had happened while I was back on the reservation in Rosebud, South Dakota. At 5 minutes to 9, I knocked on the door marked Indian Relocation Office. As I entered the reception area, I saw a neatly groomed, attractive Indian woman who greeted me with a smile. I was a little surprised, given my earlier visions of cold and gloom. The office and staff appeared professional and competent. My initial impression was a positive one. But now I began to wonder about my own appearance. All the men wore neat slacks, shirts, and ties. I began to feel uncomfortable with the way I was dressed. I had on well-worn cowboy boots with traces of South Dakota mud on them. My jeans and shirt need laundering, or so I was told by the interviewer. I just wanted to disappear. I was told that I would be given a clothing order. At the end of the day, after the laborious task of being interviewed, answering questions about my background, and filling out numerous forms, I was told to report back the following day at the same time. I would be taken for another interview with a prospective employer. Meanwhile, I was to continue living at the YMCA until other housing arrangements could be made for me. Bus fare and money for meals were to be supplied by the program until I received my first month's paycheck. I was hired by Continental Can Company as a stockman at an hourly wage of $2.28, which was good money in the 1950s. The money for transportation and food was to be picked up at the office every Friday evening. It was on these Fridays that I began to meet other Native Americans. Some would come right from work, still wearing the grease and grime of the day. Others were relatively clean and sometimes had responsible jobs, such as shipping clerk, light machine operators, or loading dock checker. After I had been on my job for approximately 3 weeks, I was ready to assume the responsibility of paying rent, shopping for food, and most importantly, learning how to manage my own paycheck. All of this was too good to be true, as I was laid off the following month. Many employees were laid off because of inventory prior to the Christmas and New Year's holiday. This was the first of many problems I would encounter on my downward spiral to the skids. The only thing I could think of at this point was to go back to the relocation office and inform the staff of the layoff. After a brief interview at the relocation office, I was given a letter of reference and instructed to report to Readymen Inc. on North Avenue and Halsted Streets at 1 p.m. Readymen, a daily pay office, played a large role in the lives of Native Americans who had either been laid off or terminated from their jobs. Many of the Native Americans, former relocation clients, were working out of this daily pay office. Entire families were working out of the Uptown Readyman office. The connection between the relocation office and Readyman was quite obvious to me. As I walked into the Readyman office with my letter of reference, I was stared at and sized up by a group of Indians who were standing in one corner of the room. I overheard one asking others in Lakota who I was. The four walls of the room were lined with rough wooden benches. There was loud and boisterous conversation coming from several of the groups of men in the huge room. I had been warned to watch my pockets. The room was crowded with men who were either waiting for a check or waiting for a work ticket on the swing or the midnight shift. Others sat quietly on the bench, staring anxiously at the dispatcher who stood behind an elevated counter that separated the office from the waiting room. These men probably had not received a work ticket for the day. Almost everyone in the room was aware of the cold December weather at this time of the year. You had to keep up with the rent money. Minimum wage was $1 per hour, and if you failed to get a work ticket, you could be out on the street. After taxes and car fare, an 8-hour check would barely cover living expenses. The dispatcher began calling out names of some of the men who were either getting a work ticket or a Readyman check. A hush would fall over the crowd when the dispatcher leaned out over the counter with work tickets or checks in his hand. Some of the men would stand right in front of the elevated counter, and we'd be told to step aside for men coming in with signed work tickets from the job site. You could not get paid without a ticket signed by the employer at the job site. A group of Native Americans continued to laugh and joke with each other in a boisterous manner. They acted like they did not have a care in the world. It was approximately 4 p.m., and other Native Americans began to come in with what appeared to be signed work tickets. As each one stepped into the room, he would be loudly greeted with, "Here's a live one. He can buy a jug." Like working for Readyman, the use of the jug of wine as a social lubricant was part of the way of life for many Indians who had originally come to Chicago on the relocation program and ended up on Skid Row. Some were either separated or divorced from loved ones. Others just found life on Skid Row more acceptable. There were no social or economic barriers there. About half of the Indians who picked up Readyman checks would end up cruising Skid Row at night. Career paths on Skid Row. The Indian on Skid Row worked almost every day. In groups of drinking friends, they would find work from the ever-increasing number of daily pay offices like Readyman that sprouted up on Skid Row. Some of these offices had lucrative contracts with work sites, paying more than the minimum wage at $1.15 an hour. One site office would send experienced lumber handlers even to the far suburbs to contract whole boxcars loaded with lumber. They would contract a flat rate for board feet unloaded from the boxcar. Each Indian lumber handler wanted a fast and experienced handler to work with. The sooner the box was unloaded, the sooner you got paid, which was a major motivating factor in picking a partner. Since two good Indian lumber handlers could unload a boxcar of lumber in one day at $100 or more a car, they were considered one of 2 or 3 groups of the elite on Skid Row. All Indian lumber handlers tended to drink together and to tell tall stories about how many board feet of lumber the partners unloaded in an unbelievably short time. A second group of elites was found among the Indians employed by Readyman Inc. Not all, but proven groups were consistently invited back to work the various conventions, trade shows, and other city-sponsored events, including the Blackhawks and Bulls games, as well as the ice capades at the Chicago Stadium. Some of the Canadian Indians would tease and joke with famous Bobby Hull of the Chicago Blackhawks, who is also a Canadian. Readyman also had special crews made up of Indians living on or near Skid Row to work the trade show expositions that were held at the Palmer House, Conrad Hilton, and the newly built McCormick Place in the early 1960s. These Indians worked alongside the union members, such as electricians, carpenters, dock workers, machinery movers, and other highly paid skilled workers whose union wages were sometimes 3 or 4 times higher than the going minimum wage paid to the Indians working out of the Readyman office. Local 214 of Teamsters Union permitted the Readyman crew to load, unload, and move exhibits to halls with a union permit. Although readyman crews, including the Indians, were relegated to busting freight, unloading heavy crates from tractor trailers, such work was preferable to setting dollies under 700 or 800-pound crates and pushing them into the exhibition halls. At the very least, you could always sneak a drink while working inside the trailers there at the Hilton Hotel. This Indian crew was familiar with all the nearest bar and liquor stores in and around the Conrad Hilton. They were referred to as the Hilton crew. They could be depended on to work long hours, especially when one show had to be moved out because another and different show had to be moved in. It was not unusual to work round the clock, go upstairs and sleep for 2 or 3 hours, and come back to start on the trailers that were lined up for 2 blocks waiting to be unloaded. The crew would routinely work 38, 40, or 42 hours in one shift. Indians living on Skid Row looked forward to the trade shows because jugs were always available. There were lots of hiding places to stash jugs, and they got plenty of fancy, rich food that was left over from the banquet and dinners held by various organizations at the Hilton. Teamsters and machinery movers shared tips with the readyman crew so that no one ever ran out of change for more jugs. Lastly, United Exposition paid time and a half for 8 hours. The money was great for Indians living on Skid Row and working out of a daily pay office. Most would complete the first 8 hours at straight pay and go on time and a half for the rest of the 5 days allowed by the labor board. With 2 or 3 hours of sleep per shift, United Exposition paid for 2 rooms in the hotel, you could build up a lot of hours, and with tips, could almost feel rich. Meanwhile, United Exposition also had an Indian crew working on the same trade show at the Palmer House, with the same advantages and rewards. The dock supervisors were, for the most part, ex-readymen who were hired to work directly for United Expositions. One such boss was an Indian called Big John, not his real name, who was tough on Indians caught drinking or drunk. If you were caught in the act of tipping a jug, or if you were observed making a mad dash to the trailer from the bar across Wabash Avenue, you were immediately assigned to pick up your readyman work ticket and go home. You were, however, expected to return at 8 a.m. the following day, or sooner, since the trailers were being unloaded throughout the day and night. It only took about 4 hours to sober up, and the readyman Indian would always be welcomed back on the job. He would be good for another 40 hours of working inside the trailers. Most Indians from the far north side readyman office, and many non-Indians, were not willing to put in long hours, and were always ready to go home after completing 8 hours. Those Indians living on Skid Row were called crazy by the north side Indians, because they would continuously hustle to get those trade shows in and out on schedule. Bosses liked this. When shows were officially opened to the buying public and during the 3 or 4 days scheduled for the event, the Madison Street Indians were off. They would pick up their $300 or $400 checks at the readyman office. Although few Indians went out on the work trains as gandy dancers, railroad repair workers, those that did would return to Chicago late in fall and rocking chair, draw railroad unemployment compensation through the winter months, many joining other Indians on Skid Row. Life on Skid Row. Readymen paychecks would be cashed at the Barrel House on North Avenue and Halsted Street. There would be hearty laughter, teasing, and boisterous joking while each crew member took his turn buying a round of 15-cent suds, steins of beer, for his peers. When references were made to "from Madison Street," they were usually voiced in a haughty manner by other Indians. Actually, some of the Indians from Madison Street considered themselves better off because there was no need to cop a front, and they were responsible only for themselves. They would tell you that you could survive Skid Row without doing a lick of work. There were the missions, soup lines, Catholic Charities, Salvation Army, and other social service organizations on or near Skid Row. A clean change of clothes was available at most of these missions. You could even shower and shave at city-operated facilities on Madison Street. It was possible to stay neat and clean while living on Skid Row. After finishing several rounds of suds at the Barrel House, the Indian trade show crews began to break up into smaller groups of drinking buddies. Despite the extra hard-earned cash, they would then buy a jug or two and make the 15-block trek back to Madison Street. An Indian working for readymen would tell you, I can walk anywhere or carry the stick all night if I have a jug in my pocket. A jug was a powerful companion. Since these small groups of Indians were dusty, moldy, and considered rich, live ones, on the street, the first choice was to go to one of the many secondhand stores to buy clean clothes. Then they would check into a flop house to shower and shave and check out the Indian bar, the Jackpot. Once inside the Jackpot, the Indian trade show crews would be given respect equal to another elite group, the Indian lumber handlers. There was that saying, money talks. Many of the bars at which the Indian lumber handlers drank on Skid Row, like the restaurants and flop houses, were owned by the same daily pay offices they drew their pay from after unloading the boxcars. To say those Indians were coerced into spending their paycheck at those establishments owned by the slave market, daily pay office, is an understatement. Paychecks, in reality, were vouchers good only at the slave market's bar. Meal tickets to be used at the company restaurant were handed out. They also took deductions of a generous fee for transportation and lunch money, plus 2 or 3 nights of their mice, roach, and grayback, body lice, infested flophouse. The idea was to keep the workers broke and owing money so that they were almost forced to come back and continue to work under the aforementioned circumstances. All the daily pay offices tended to operate in this way. Since most Indians living on Skid Row had no permanent mailing address, the slave markets, the American Indian Center, and of course the Indian bars were only too willing to receive and hold checks. Slave markets and bars were more likely to be the mailing addresses because they were within walking distance and checks could be cashed there, especially at the bars where credit was more easily established. Credit, or an advance on a veteran's pension check, meant that some veterans signed over their checks to the bar owners and began drinking up the next month's check. A secondhand store on Skid Row catered to the needs of all Gandy dancers. The owner, who was nicknamed Identity Sam, would extend credit and sometimes cash to Gandy dancers who needed only to show railroad identification cards to earn the credit. In addition, Indian Gandy dancers would bring in boots, jackets, and other winter gear, such as ill-conditioned shoes and winter caps, for the price of a jug or two. The Jackpot. The Jackpot was often referred to as the Indian Bar by Indians and non-Indians alike. Although the bar had been rumored to be mob-controlled, the title to the bar was in the name of the Indian wife who married the Italian owner. The Jackpot was known as a place where you could get hustled, jackaroled, beaten, and thrown bodily out in the street. However, the Jackpot also had its good points. It was relatively safe for non-Indians and Indians alike if they were known by the Jackpot crowd. Since most of the Indians who frequented the Jackpot worked out of Readyman or out of another of the many daily pay offices on Skid Row, they would buy jugs and just hang out at the tables until closing time. Some of the positive things about this bar were that free hot dogs and ham sandwiches were served to all steady customers, and complete turkey or chicken dinners were also served on special holidays, such as Christmas, Thanksgiving, and Easter Sunday. As a come-on, a raffle ticket was given for every drink purchased at the bar, and winning tickets were worth $4 at the 9 p.m. and 11 p.m. drawings. The final drawing was held at 2 a.m., closing time. The winning prize was a take-home half pint, and the lucky winner would jokingly be accused of being in cahoots with the bar owner. A half pint would not last in the bottle gang that would form shortly after closing time. After closing was also a time to be on the lookout for Tuttle and Augie in the police bum wagon. The police knew most of the heavy drinkers and considered them relatively harmless. If you were caught with a jug, they would direct you to go to the main drag to get out of sight and to finish the bottle. Don Eagle, an Indian who took the name of a famous wrestler, would jokingly challenge the detectives to a wrestling match. They would decline, often with a chuckle. A favorite watering hole of the Gandy dancers, complete with sleeping quarters, was a flop house located near Identity Sam's store. The bar stools were the only seating available. With the exception of an old jukebox, the floor was bare of any of the furniture usually present in Skid Row watering holes. Gallon jugs of wine were placed at intervals on the floor by the Gandhi dancers, who gathered there to rehash and trade tall tales about working and living in the different towns and states. It seemed natural to focus in on the drinking environment in some of the small towns where local police might have been especially tough on Gandhi dancers. The Gandhi dancers were a generous lot. Anyone from the street was welcome to take a drink from the jugs on the floor. It was like an open house. An Indian could walk in, take a drink from each of the many jugs on the floor, double clutch on the jug located nearest the Indian Gandhi dancers, and walk out the lobby door stoned drunk. The unwritten rule was one from each jug, unless you were invited to stick around. The Bottle Gang. Indians living on Skid Row would continue to develop survival skills and use the resources available in the Skid Row environment. Scoring a jug was a shared goal. A few of the hardcore Indian Skid Row residents would tell you that activities leading up to the scoring of a jug could be almost fun. 3 Indians would team up to put into practice the skills that led up to scoring a jug. One would act as a lookout for the dicks, detectives in the chosen area, while 2 others would each take one side of the street and begin to put the hammer on every passerby. The slogan was, "Don't let anyone pass you by." These 2 panhandlers competed with one another to see who had the most change at the end of the run. After a 3-way split of the change, the Indians would retire to an isolated location, usually a doorway, an alley, or an abandoned building, with a jug. After cracking the bottle of white port and tossing a cap full out with "Here's one for the boys," the drinking would begin. The ritual was common to all drinking Indians living on Skid Row, in respect of those who had passed away. The drinking of this first jug would begin, and accounts of the success and responses of some of the would-be victims of the hammer, panhandling, were recalled with humor. One of the Indians could scarcely believe that a very pretty young woman at a bus stop, despite his smelly, dusty, moldy appearance, gave him a whole $5 bill just for the asking. He continued, "I must have really looked pitiful." The joking response, "I wouldn't want to be seen in public with you," was returned from others in the group. There were different styles of putting the hammer on people. One Indian may begin his mission with, "Kind sir, can you help out a poor Sioux Indian from South Dakota trying to get back to the reservation?" This Indian was Winnebago, but was trying, with humor, to put his Sioux buddy on the spot. The drinking continued with more teasing, laughter, and joking, and the stories were becoming taller and taller, as one Indian would comment, "The bullshit is getting deeper." After the last round, when the dead soldier, empty jug, was put to rest, Bulldog was chosen to make the new run, and a parting shot from the other 2 might be, "Don't let any double clutchers see you come back here." A double clutcher was a person who would tip the jug up and drink double, sometimes triple his share of the wine. A double clutcher was an undesirable member of a bottle gang. His turn was usually last. Some Indians should be given equal billing with bloodhounds. Whether or not it was a keen sense of smell or their intuitions, these Indians seemed to follow their noses to the most isolated and hidden spots where jugs were present and were being passed around by the bottle gang. Such a person may not have been fully welcome, but was given his turn at the jug. Meanwhile, Bulldog had returned from making the run. He had been gone beyond reasonable time, or so the other 2 thought. They had begun to wonder whether Bulldog had gone south, deliberately failed to return to the group. The few Indians who were prone to going south were shunned by all drinking Indians on Skid Row. Spending the night on Skid Row. At 2 a.m. closing time, some Indians would move to a 4 a.m. bar to continue drinking. A few would carry the stick, walk the street all night. Others would go to favorite places to sleep, such as the Bird Brothers Hole under Sangamon Bridge, the parking lot behind the Merchandise Mart, Indian Docks near Milwaukee and Des Plaines, or under a huge railroad bridge beneath Halsted, Hubbard, and Green Streets, or in the bushes by the expressways. The Indians usually traveled in 2s or 3s, as there was a lot of competition for spots to sleep. It was also necessary to take a couple of jugs for the morning after, although a very few Indians would resist taking a drink at night when it was so readily available. Indian Docks was the most popular choice for many Native Americans, simply because it was so difficult to climb the steep hill from Milwaukee Avenue near Des Plaines Street to get to the dock that it was relatively safe from police and other intruders. It was also clean, free of rats, and a good place either to sober up or to continue drinking. It was so difficult to climb up this steep hill that one or two of the Indians who were too drunk to make the climb had to have help. Yes, when the going gets rough, Native Americans living on Skid Row would lend a helping hand, especially if they were drinking partners. For the most part, all Indians living on Skid Row were close, especially those within a particular drinking group. They tended to help each other out when the need arose. A good example of this cooperation was among the group of Indians who resided under the railroad bridge. Each Indian seemed to know exactly what his task was and would carry it out without thinking twice about it. One Indian would make a sweep of the alleys near factories and along the railroads for firewood. 2 or 3 of the boys would go to the market to forage for vegetables and soup bones. Another one would assign himself the task of hauling the water needed for the soup pot. The soup pot in use was an old 5-gallon lard can. Many had experienced the hobo jungles throughout the United States and learned from them. Since this railroad bridge was a huge semi-enclosed structure, there were 3 other ethnic groups represented here, including a Mexican Indian group, 4 or 5 African Americans, and a group of whites. Each group had their own spot or territory staked out with the usual overcoats, blankets, and cooking pot. True to the old saying about honesty among thieves, these drunks respected each other's camps and would not intrude on one another unless they were invited to partake in the soup or to have a drink of wine. They did not steal from each other when one or more of the groups were out for the day. Another more exclusive group of Indians hung out east of the expressway near the Harbor Light Salvation Army. These Indians did not work out of any daily pay office, but preferred to be pieced off by the few from their group who were on the Salvation Army's work program for alcoholics. These few Indians were paid wages by the work program set up by the Salvation Army. They would take turns getting on the work program and then would share the wages. Other Indians who hung out west of the expressway were not welcomed by this Sally bunch. They even had their own spot to sleep, drink, or just hang out. It was under the Lake Street Bridge on the east side of the expressway. This spot was neatly arranged with a rug on the dirt floor, well equipped with overcoats and blankets and shelves made from cardboard boxes. One Indian woman and her younger brother shared this living arrangement, as well as the drinking and scouring of jugs. She later died of cirrhosis of the liver and other physical ailments directly attributed to the drinking environment and lifestyles. Trouble with the law. Drinking on the street, in alleys or doorways, and being locked up in jail became the accepted lifestyle on Skid Row for most Indians. Small groups of Indian men, and sometimes women, there were 4 women on the street then, could be found on a street corner, in an alley, or in a doorway, passing a jug of wine around and seeming to have a good time. There was always a lot of laughing and joking among the various tribes of Indians. This kind of group was called a bottle gang by police, who seemed to know all the hiding places where Indians would drink. Depending on how much room was left in the paddy wagon, or how the policemen felt that evening, this so-called bottle gang would more than likely spend the night in jail. A female, of course, would be excluded by the police, even though she would usually just join up with another bottle gang down the street. It was not unusual for many of the Indians to get arrested for drinking on the street or becoming too drunk for their own safety. Police in the paddy wagons and squad cars, including detectives, knew most of the Indians by name, and if you were a favorite, they would sometimes give you a bottle that had been confiscated from some poor wino. The Indians also knew the police by name, shift, and route. They also knew how often the paddy wagon came around a certain block to a bar or an alley. Each policeman had a nickname, such as Cactus Jack and Hook Nose, Tuttle and Augie, detectives, Mutt and Jeff. Police brutality was no stranger to the Indian on Skid Row. The most notorious of the pairs were Cactus Jack and Hook Nose. These 2 policemen were the most feared, not only by the Indians, but by all Skid Row residents, because they seemed to take delight in throwing drunks headfirst into the paddy wagon after beating them with their nightsticks. Over the years, a few of the Indians had suffered a broken rib or two. Cactus Jack especially seemed to enjoy giving the arrested Indian a couple of whacks alongside the head as he was being processed for the drunk tank at the station. Drunk tank, bullpen, cells, steel bunks, and bologna sandwiches were all terms that were all too common for Indians living on Skid Row. Over time, many of us have lost count of the number of times we had been arrested for being intoxicated. For Indians on Skid Row, going to jail was an accepted part of life. Drunk tanks and the smaller cells were not too bad to lie down in during the early part of the evening, but space became a problem after closing time for the bars on the streets. By this time, you were sober enough to realize that you could no longer lie in peace, even if it was on a cold steel bunk or the cement floor. Incoming drunks were continually being packed into every inch of space in the bullpen and the cells. Some of the drunks would fall down on top of some poor Indian who was trying to sleep. Once in the tank, a drunk loudly demanded that I move over to make room for him on the floor. I knew that this kind of arrangement was not going to work with a drunk lying there next to me. I was lucky enough to spot a small space underneath one of the steel bunks. Because I was slender, probably from malnutrition, I was able to slide under this man's steel bunk for protection from the commotion as incoming drunks jockeyed for a place to sit or to lie down. It was not safe to lie out in the open floor. Some drunk attempting to reach the one commode or wash basin at the back of the cell would stagger and sometimes fall on top of the now sober men lying on the floor trying to sleep. It was likely that someone in this crowd would become sick, and while attempting to reach the commode, would spray vomit down on those below. It was now 3 a.m., and the turnkey, the policeman in charge of the drunk tank, would come around to chase everyone into the bullpen. The smaller cells had to be emptied out so that they could be swept, mopped, and hosed down for later use. When the cells became full again, the vicious cycle would continue. Sometimes it was a merciful one for the chronically addicted Indian drunk, especially when it was extremely cold outside. He was safer in jail. Meanwhile, the bullpen was packed so tightly we felt like sardines. At 3 a.m., the only prisoners who were still locked up in 2 or 3 of the smaller cells were the more serious offenders, who would be taken to court at 26th Street in California at 5 a.m. These prisoners were usually charged with jack-rolling, strong-arm robbery, picking pockets, stealing cars, burglary, and armed holdups at taverns. With a few exceptions, Indians were rarely charged with any of these offenses. Despite the hangovers, the Indians in the crowded bullpen had maneuvered themselves into a space and were having animated conversation, joking, teasing, and laughing among themselves. As usual, the topic of conversation was the jug, and if it would be wise to volunteer for janitorial duty at the jail on Monroe and Racine. To work as a janitor meant that no one would be allowed to leave the building until court was terminated upstairs. Sometimes it was a good idea to volunteer for duty as a janitor because volunteers did not go before the judge. For example, if you showed up in court with a black eye, the judge might give you 10, 20, or 30 days out in the House of Correction. It was also a good idea to volunteer as a janitor because the bullpen became almost intolerable. The odor of unwashed bodies, vomit, urine, and mixture of stale beer and wine fouled what little was left of the precious air. Arguments and fighting among the drunks sometimes broke out over a tiny space to sit or stand in, and everyone was trying to get far away from some wino who was painstakingly picking body lice off of his vomit-stained shirt or jacket. The turnkey would call for volunteers to pass out the bologna sandwiches and hot, strong black coffee. He had his favorites, including a few of the Indians, whom he would then let out of the bullpen to begin sweeping down empty cells that still had the signs of drunks spending an uncomfortable night, especially when 8 or 9 drunks had been packed into 2-man cells. After sweeping the empty cells, the Indian volunteers were more or less free to wander around the cell blocks. More bologna sandwiches and coffee were available if you were hungry, but it was very difficult to hold down water, much less a bologna sandwich, when you had a hangover. It was then time for the sick, sorry, and sober drunks from the bullpens to be sent upstairs to go before the judge. Most judges who sat on the drunk court bench were well known by the Indians, and vice versa. The judge would most likely address each Indian with, "Chief, what name are you using this morning? Is it Rainwater or Santa Maria?" Even after years of going up in front of Judge Stein, Kelly, or O'Malley, for example, the drunken Native Americans would use one or more fictitious names of well-known Indians of the past: Crazy Horse, Don Eagle, or Rainwater. The judges were not fooled, but would play along. While courtroom proceedings were going on, the Indian volunteer janitors were escorted downstairs to the basement to the police locker rooms to remedy those hangovers. A couple of the more trustworthy Indian drunks were sent on a run to Voight's wine shop, which was located around the corner from the police station at Monroe and Racine, to bring back half a gallon of wine. Now, the unpleasant task of trying to hold down the first drink became a must for everyone in the group. It was especially difficult when shaking badly because of withdrawal from the drug alcohol. More alcohol was the remedy for that hangover, and the hangover was routinely accepted as a part of the drinking environment by Native Americans living on Skid Row. Let us not forget about the Native Americans who had elected to go before the presiding judge at drunk court. It had been a long night for some of these people, especially if they had been picked up earlier in the evening. The call to the stand before the judge could also be a difficult time. It was not unusual for one or two of these hangover Indians to pull a wingding, to have an alcohol seizure, in front of the judge. When this happens, the seizure victim is a sure bet to be sentenced for a 10-day stretch out at the House of Corrections. Cermak Hospital was out there, and the judges who were increasingly aware of alcoholism would ask those with the shakes if they needed to go to the hospital. Others with mild to moderate hangovers would be directed to an AA person who was present at the court session. This AA person was a detective who would take the hungover Indian to his office and give him his medicine, wine or whiskey, to calm him down. There was also a social worker available to those who had their shoes stolen or were badly in need of a clean shirt. A representative from the Salvation Army, Harbor Light, would hand each one of the now sober men a breakfast ticket that was good for a bowl of oatmeal, a roll, and coffee at the Harbor Light Center. Since drunk court had been cleared of all who were deemed well enough to walk out by the judge, the Indian janitors had the final chore of sweeping and mopping all the second floor, including the holding pen, which was located adjacent to the courtroom. After helping to knock out a half gallon of wine while waiting in the basement, they felt more than ready to complete this final chore and then head to Voight's for a jug. Voight's Wine Shop, which was located at 1100 West Adams Street, was a large family-owned liquor store that catered mostly to small tavern operators. The store was a half a block long and a half a block wide, with 3 warehouses located in the same building. Nearly all the Indians, after being turned loose by the judge, would immediately head to Voight's, where a quart of cheap wine might have cost 50 cents, a price far out of reach for Indians who have just gotten out of jail. So they might have to settle for a flat one, a pint. In anticipation of this moment, the Indians had often counted their change and chipped in while still locked up in the cells the previous night. The Indians who were lucky enough to somehow avoid going to jail would come to Voight's to take advantage of specials and sales. Where else could you buy a fifth of Golden Spur, 21% volume, for 50 cents? Passing around the Golden Spur, the Indians would hang together in a large group, seemingly high in spirits, alcohol-induced. There would be 3 distinct smaller groups within the larger one. The first would be the ones who did not spend the night in jail. The second, the ones who were processed through the court system. The third, the janitors who were well on their way to another drunken episode. It was clearly understood as an unwritten rule that each smaller group member who had chipped in would share the jug with only his own group. All Native Americans went through a ritual when cracking a jug, opening a bottle. When cracking a jug, you should hold the jug firmly in one hand at a 45-degree angle and whack the bottom sharply with the heel of the hand in order to jar the seal loose. The cap of the jug was then filled with some of the precious wine and tossed out in the name of former drinking friends who had passed on. After all means of scoring another jug were exhausted, those Indians who were still relatively sober will go to the readyman office to try to get a work ticket for night work. Others would hang around the store to hustle customers, tavern owners. Mr. Voigt would allow a select few of the Indians to help customers load their cars or trucks for tips. Like the police, the customers also knew the Indians by name and were sometimes generous to a fault with their tips. Remember that a fifth of golden spur costs only 50 cents. Each Indian hustler would make $5 or $10 in 2 to 3 hours. This entire scenario would be repeated almost every day by Indians who gathered at Voight's, not only to score jugs, but to shoot the bull. Shooting the bull would involve conversations about how and where each tramp, Indians would not allow themselves to be called bums, survived the night. Stories were told, for example, about who had been thrown out of the jackpot for bringing a foreign jug into the bar. Management demanded that you buy your jugs in the bar you visited. Although opening a bottle of wine in the bar might have been against the law, bartenders seemed to encourage Indians, at least those who could afford it, to buy jugs, sit at a table, and drink until closing time at 2 a.m. Over the years, many Indians died while drinking and passing out at those tables. No one at the bar was really surprised when John or Jane Doe, from all appearances sleeping it off, in reality had died from alcoholism. Escaping from the Skid Row lifestyle. The Salvation Army and other similar treatment programs, including doing time at the House of Corrections, temporarily prolonged the lives of most of the Indians living on Skid Row. Today, however, this writer, who lived on Skid Row for approximately 17 years, cannot count more than 5 survivors from that era. Because of excessive drinking, nutritional deficit, and the lack of proper rest, the resistance of the body to many kinds of diseases, tuberculosis, cirrhosis, and others, was lowered. The Salvation Army had a clinic that took care of the health needs of nearly all the Indians living on Skid Row. A volunteer doctor, 2 or 3 nurses, and a paid health advocate attended to the health needs of all Skid Row residents. The health advocate, called Lacey, was the favorite of the Indians, who, more often than not, would ask to see Lacey when seeking medical attention for street-related combat wounds. Since a chest x-ray was routine when visiting the clinic, those Indians with active tuberculosis were usually tracked down by the court system. Word was sent out through the Indian grapevine on the street, or they were caught at the next visit to the clinic and taken to the Municipal Tuberculosis Sanitarium located on North Pulaski Road. With the development of more advanced tuberculosis medications in the 1960s, it was no longer necessary to be confined to a sanitarium for more than 2 months, depending on the severity of the case. However, Indians did not like to be confined in a hospital setting, and as a result, would overstay passes. An immediate pickup order was then sent out by the City Board of Health, and those Indians unlucky enough to show up before the judge at Chicago Avenue or Monroe and Racine Drunk Court would be held for transfer back to the tuberculosis sanitarium. Since Skid Row was home to nearly all Indians at the sanitarium, they would invariably go back to Madison Street to continue the former well-developed lifestyle. They would continue to score jugs, forego proper nutrition, and sleep out under bridges at Indian docks or in the hole. After being discharged from the sanitarium, former patients were required to visit a tuberculosis clinic at Ogden and Taylor Streets and to continue with medications for up to 2 years as part of the aftercare plan. An important part of the aftercare plan was abstinence, preferably total from all drinking of all alcohol. Medications would be rendered useless by the alcohol. Abstention was the most difficult part of the aftercare plan for the Indians living on Skid Row, as their whole lifestyle seemed to revolve around drinking. For the most part, former tuberculosis patients who were relatively successful in completing 2 years of aftercare would fall off the wagon later from the debilitating disease of alcoholism. Conclusion: development of Skid Row and displacement of Skid Row residents. The Skid Row that I was introduced to as I stepped out of the Northwestern train depot in October 1957 has long since been torn down. Economic development, urban renewal, and demolition of favorite watering holes came slowly at first. Since the flop houses were owned by millionaires, they were the first to go. Parking lots and corporate businesses began to spring up on the now empty lots along Skid Row. By 1977, some stretches of Skid Row resembled the prairie found in my home state of South Dakota. The Indians on Skid Row appeared to be undaunted by all this activity by the now familiar wrecking ball. Bottle gangs no longer had to go to jail for drunkenness. Instead, they would be transported by bum wagons to Haymarket House, a detox center that began operating in June 1976. Treatment for alcoholism, not jail, was advocated by American Medical Association. Readymen and other daily pay offices continued to be used as before. Detox centers became places to sleep one off, or you could just walk out after the intake process had been completed. By the 1980s, Madison Street had almost ceased to exist as Skid Row because of the declining population and urban renewal. It would be unfair to say Indians tend to drink to excess to drown any or all problems. After all, the statistics tell us that only about 5 or 6% of all alcoholics end up on the skids. Today, a small percentage of Indians who had been former residents of Skid Row survived and are now leading useful lives. There are several single Indians and families who have made it to retirement or are leading useful and successful lives after coming to Chicago on relocation. Others have returned to their reservations. Single men were mobile and able to go anywhere, especially after layoffs and terminations from employment. After the many years of living and interacting with Native Americans on Skid Row, I have found that most were comfortable with the environment and lifestyle. Prices on Skid Row were within the reach of a readyman paycheck. Despite what seemed to be a life of hardship, the tragic deaths of drinking companions, carrying the stick, staying on the street all night, and standing in soup lines, Skid Row was a sort of home to many Indians who had originally come to Chicago on the infamous federal relocation program.